Greetings, fellow historians. Welcome to another lesson as we now take a look at the European side of the Second World War. We spent a rather exhaustive amount of time looking at the island hopping campaigns of the Americans in the Pacific. And so now it's time to turn our sights on Europe. What is going on at the same time as the United States is fighting a two-front war? And so without further ado, let's get right down to brass tacks and get down to business. And of course, it all is going to come down to how is the United States going to get onto continental Europe. There have been two opportunities for the United States, along with its allies, to do this. That's going to be from North Africa up into Italy and come then across Italy. But there's a geographical barrier between Italy and Germany called the Alps, and that's going to be difficult to move tanks and equipment through that region. Then we're going to find the United States is going to look at crossing the English Channel and invading continental Europe in France. But where is that invasion going to take place? That is going to be the phenomenal question that Eisenhower and the Allies are going to have to be answering in the days and the years ahead as the European campaign gets underway. So we are looking at the overarching question in this particular lesson about the causes and effects of victory of the United States and its allies over the Axis powers. And that was subdivided between the battles in the Pacific, and now we're going to be looking at the battles in the Atlantic, or at least in the European theater. And in our last discussion, that Pacific theater constituted some pretty dark days of Pearl Harbor and the Bataan Death March, some of the more somber moments in the American military presence there in the Pacific. But we do see victories at the Battle of Midway and Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Victories I put in lowercase and in quotation marks, because while the United States was able to be victorious, we do have to pause and look at the monumental life that was lost, the sacrifices that were made at each of these campaigns for the United States to be successful. And then the overarching question, which we'll be asking in the next lesson, is should the United States invade the island of Honshu? That's the largest of the Japanese archipelago islands comprising the Japanese territory. And would a land invasion prove to be successful or too difficult? Would more lives be lost? As the United States faces 2 million plus Japanese troops on the mainland in its efforts to go after Tokyo. What would be another way to perhaps bring Japan to its knees? And that's going to be a difficult decision that President Harry Truman is going to have to make. Remember, Truman is now looking over the war at this point in 45 after the untimely death of Franklin Roosevelt in his fourth term as president. And he'll make that decision on whether or not to drop bombs in Hiroshima and in Nagasaki. But for today, we're going to turn our gaze towards the European theater, looking at North Africa and Italy, the D-Day invasion and Battle of the Bulge. So we're going to explain the causes and effects of the victory of the United States at North Africa and Italy, Normandy in the Battle of the Bulge, and what is it about the efforts of this war that makes it different. This is also a good opportunity, perhaps in your writing, to compare and contrast the Pacific theater. We see a lot of amphibious assaults and uneven terrain and various climates in the Pacific theater. Where in the European theater, there was basically two major amphibious assaults, one that occurred in North Africa and, of course, the other at Normandy. And then the United States and its allies moving through urban areas of Europe. They are beset by climate. We're going to see a substantial climate change for the Americans at the Battle of the Bulge in the middle of winter. But the topography and the landscape itself didn't in Europe seem to be proved as problematic as it did for the troops with regards to the guerrilla campaigns there in the Pacific fighting the Japanese there. I want to look at three specific areas, and I'm going to get my pointer out here for just a second. We're going to focus on this campaign. You know, the United States in Operation Torch, along with the British, are going to invade here in North Africa, just east of Morocco, and push across the northern part of Africa through the Sahara, through the upper portions of that continent, and look for crossings of the Mediterranean, amphibious assaults into Italy. That's going to be some characters that you'll see you won't be responsible for memorizing these characters, but Rommel and Montgomery and Patton, these major characters, are going to be responsible for the campaigns in the South. And then we're going to find the D-Day invasion there. We're going to talk about where the United States and its allies should have arrived on the shores. Where was Germany expecting the Allies to arrive? Where did the Allies, in fact, arrive? And the success of that campaign, which almost didn't happen because of weather. And then the Battle of the Bulge, we're going to call it Hitler's last stand, if you will, kind of reminiscent of Custer's last stand. So looking at the destination Berlin and North Africa and Italy, the British and American troops invaded in 42 with over 500 ships and 1,450 amphibious assault vehicles. And I talk about amphibious assault vehicles, meaning the ones that start in the water and arrive on the shore. And this is going to be a tremendous undertaking that is going to require the efforts of the Allies, the likes that the world has never seen at this point. This is pre-D-Day. So this type of amphibious assault into North Africa, the totality of this response was really a eye-opening an eye-opening endeavor for both the Allies as what they were capable of doing, and eye-opening for the Germans and the Axis seeing what the Allies were capable of. So this is going to prove to be a great success, in which they're going to move across North Africa and push back the Italian forces, Mussolini's forces that have already advanced as far south as Egypt and Ethiopia, and in efforts to take Italy, and then of course strike Germany from the south. But we don't see as many assaults from the south because of that physical geography of the Alps. It's going to require the efforts of coming into continental Europe from either the north or from the west. And as that arrival occurred, what would be the shortest distance possible that would prove to be the most cost effective, the most that would minimize troop casualties the most, and where would that assault occur in their efforts to take Berlin? Erwin Rommel, the German general, is going to be known as the Desert Fox. This type of warfare that takes place in North Africa is going to be fought with tanks and lots of ground battle. Very little air warfare is taking place here, much different than what we saw in Midway. But the chasing of Rommel and Montgomery through the North African deserts, while much more focused on a world history lesson, doesn't have as much of the American influence in that until the United States gets into Italy, which is why we shift as U.S. historians our focus on two specific campaigns, the D-Day invasion and the Battle of the Bulge. Logistics and supplies, though, however, are going to be challenging for this part of the world because of the physical geography. Taking a look at the picture, you see North Africa is a desert. The opportunity to drop provisions and to get weaponry into this area is going to be slow going and problematic. And so any kind of effort or assault on going after both the Italians and the Germans need to be more effective, and that's going to be handled from the west. So where would you, from a mainland invasion, looking at this map, where would you invade from? So we have North Africa. We're going to try to come in from the south and come up through Italy, but that's going to be stopped largely by the Appalachian Mountains. You have to remember, Germany is fighting significant forces in very famous world history battles, like the Battle of Leningrad and Stalingrad there in the east. And that's a lesson for world history students. We're focusing on the U.S. involvement in the European theater. We could look potentially at maybe an assault from the north through the Netherlands, but there's going to be a lot of fortification in this area of Germans. It'd be too difficult to get armaments around Denmark, and this is so close to Germany that it would be rather obvious. Germany, of course, had a strong naval presence in this area, so any large movements of the kind of manpower, the kind of equipment that you need for a continental invasion would certainly be seen by the Germans. The Germans might anticipate a crossing here at Calais. This is the most narrow portion of the English Channel, and so Germany is going to put a lot of its defenses here in the area of Calais near Dunkirk to try to push back any kind of assault of a mainland invasion. But it's going to be Eisenhower and the other military leaders at the time, Bradley and these guys, that are going to determine that it is going to be farther southwest in the area of the Normandy region near Bayeux, where that invasion is going to be most successful. So why Normandy? Well, Pas de Calais is the shortest crossing, but more fortifications and heavily defended. So Germans were expecting an attack there. So the United States, and what I thought is rather humorous, along with the Allies, they actually blew up large, not blow up as an explosion, but like inflatables and cardboard cutouts and wood cutouts, placed aircraft and tank along this area of the shores. So when German reconnaissance planes would fly over, they would look down and see massive gatherings of aircraft and tanks. And so they were tricking them, for a lack of better terms, in making them think that there was going to be a large invasion there at Pas de Calais. Dieppe, which is the other area. This raid in 1942 did show difficulties in a direct attack. The British, prior to the arrival of the United States, did try to send an amphibious assault in Dieppe, but that proved to be very, very ineffective and not an area that would find itself to be successful. In fact, I would urge you to go back and watch the movie Dunkirk, in which the British would try to do some continental invasions, some land invasions here in the northwestern part of Europe, and weren't very successful in doing so. We could look at Brittany, but that's too far out. That's going to be out of fighter range. Remember, those aircraft have got to cross the English Channel. And so it's going to be at this portion there at Normandy that they're going to find both suitable beaches. It's going to be within the air range, and it's not too heavily defended. So that's going to be the point in which this probably monumental top secret Operation Overlord is going to take place in June of 1944. When we look at the D-Day invasion numbers, we see over 6,000 Allied vessels, just under 7,000 really, 156,000 troops and 11,500 aircraft. So just take a look at those numbers. I mean, that's monumental. You're not going to be responsible for memorizing those numbers, but it does give you kind of the overarching look at the scope of this invasion. The United States is going to be focused on Utah Beach and Omaha beaches, while gold is going to be to the British there, and then Juneau for the Canadians. 23,400 and troops are also going to, airborne troops are going to arrive in the D-Day invasion. Now, yes, what do we talk about with the D-Day invasion and with Normandy? One of the most significant and important military strategies in the history of the world. The totality of this response is easily researchable on your own. So if you find that you're personally interested in the D-Day invasion, I encourage you to go watch any of the millions of articles that are out there, any of the thousands of videos that are out there. But for the purposes of our discussion, we need to move things along at a pretty clip pace. So I feel bad that I'm not giving D-Day the kind of due diligence that I should from a historical discussion, but much of that information is out there for you to peruse at your leisure. But let's just together take a few moments and look at the scope and the importance of this monumental moment in American history.
Well, D-Day was obviously the most important single fight of that war. And of course, had we lost it, there's no telling what the outcome would have been.
Since the American entry into the war, American generals had been agitating for an opportunity to fight the Germans directly. The D-Day invasion of Normandy in June 1944, represented the cutting edge of this offensive.
Essential condition that underwrote the success of D-Day was the fact that Germany had been bled virtually to death by fighting on the Eastern Front for several years against the Red Army in the Soviet Union before D-Day ever happened.
The Germans had been preparing for this invasion as long as the Americans and the British had been, and they had been digging in. And they knew that they could inflict appalling casualties on the first units ashore. Well, somebody had to do it. And so the soldiers went, and indeed, those first units did suffer very high rates of death and wounding.
There's one thing to go on a beach with sand dunes. It's something else when you've got enemy on top of these bluffs. And for some reason, naval gunnery was either off or something went wrong there. They couldn't destroy those gun emplacements.
But eventually, the weight of the invasion took hold. The numbers of Americans, the numbers of craft, allowed the Americans and the British to establish a beachhead. And once they established a beachhead, then they could bring more and more soldiers and equipment ashore.
One thing I don't think either the Japanese or the Germans really counted on was what it meant to come up against a massive capitalist industrial power. The ability to build stuff on a massive scale with massive numbers was just something they hadn't really anticipated.
If you look back at the old photographs and the footage of that armada out there off the coast, I don't think they've ever assembled before or after anything like that.
Eventually, it was the technology, it was the weight of American weapons that tipped the balance. But at the very beginning, it was the soldiers, the ones who splashed ashore, the ones who knew that in the first wave, lots and lots of them would never come back. And those are the ones who made possible everything that followed.
The Rangers who went in first and the waves that came after them stood right up to it. And there was more bravery that day than one can hardly imagine.
The greatest generation, indeed. I think what was poignant in that small clip is the success of the D-Day invasion, of course, being the bravery and the heroic nature of the troops storming those beaches, but it really was the overwhelming of German military hardware with Allied hardware. That directly connects our discussion a few days ago with regards to America on the home front. All of that rationing, all of that scrap metaling, that rapid industrialization that took place, the direct cause of that and the effect was what we saw at that D-Day invasion. And so the United States and its allies were able to secure a foothold in northwestern France, and it just was an effort now to continue that journey, pushing from town to town to town, much like the Americans island hop in the Pacific. They're going to town hop, so to speak, through Europe until they finally get to Berlin. But they're going to be stopped at this very, very significant battle called the Battle of the Bulge. You'll see here that Winston Churchill called it the greatest American battle of the war. This was Hitler's last stand in an effort to split the Allies. The Allies are moving their way eastward, and it was Hitler's goal to pull them apart by pushing forward. And as the German troops pushed, splitting apart the Allies, it created on the map what looked like a bulge. And so the generals began to call this the Battle of the Bulge. And it was Germany's efforts to use 200,000 troops on the first assault at the Battle of the Bulge, only to follow by 800,000 troops in reserve. So Hitler's putting everything he has on stopping the Allied advance in a small area of forest called the Ardennes in northeastern Belgium. Now, the challenge with this area for the Allies is that this was densely forested, compiled with feet and feet of snow. In that year, the winter of 44, December of 44, Europe experienced a rather harsh winter with a lot of precipitation. And so the snow slowed down tanks. And if you've walked through snow and tried to knee deep or even waist deep, you know that could significantly move troops, or significantly slow down troop movement. The other challenge with snow is that it showed foot traffic. So if German soldiers were trying to flank from the south or flank from the north, they could see previous foot traffic or tire marks from other artillery. And so the snow itself provided an opportunity for reconnaissance from both sides of the war to see where troop movement was taking place. But what occurred at the Battle of the Bulge is much like what we saw during World War I, this battle of attrition, very little movement. We talked about this in the last discussion there at Okinawa. The almost see movement in inches as far as miles. And so the Allies held on for 1 month, and it was just continuing to dig down and dig down and dig down. Now, what is interesting, and I'll get to a video here in just a second about the Battle of the Bulge, is movement eastward for the Allies up to this point was rather easy. they were able to move rather quickly. And when they finally got to the Ardennes, they kicked back. It was Christmas time, and slowed down a little bit. And in fact, USO shows, Marlene Dietrich and others would come to visit the troops and put on performances there. So prior to the German assault there at the Battle of the Bulge, the Americans thought that this was going to be easy street in continuing that journey. And so what really occurred is it caught the Americans off guard because of the 800,000 reserves and 200,000 first wave of assaults of Germans that really took them by surprise. And so the Battle of the Bulge was, as I said earlier, Hitler's last stand, but also an opportunity for the United States and its allies to dig its heels in and try to hold that bulge from moving it forward. And it was a zero-sum game. Either side had to absolutely win this. Take a look. This is some photographs of that area. You'll see the movement of those troops in that snow, the roads very difficult to find, the forests being very, very dense. There's some troops that are huddled down into, it wasn't necessarily a battle of trench warfare like we saw in World War I, but there were pockets of resistance where both the Allies and the Germans were hunkered down, firing through the snow. The other aspect of this, and just from a sheer side note, is the United States didn't anticipate this much snow in the area, and so they were caught off guard from as far as a camouflaging goes. So they were in predominantly ode green, battlefield green, or in battlefield khakis. And so they stood out very significantly in the midst of the snow because they had no camouflage that was white, like the snow there at the Battle of the Bulge. There's the bulge itself. You could see the push of the Nazi and the Axis-controlled territory. This is where the United States is going to try to fortify its defenses and push back, and that pushback is going to be drawn out over the course of just under a month. So this is going to be a very, very long campaign, resulting in thousands and thousands and thousands of deaths. Let's take a look.
During the Bulge, command broke down, supplies broke down, morale broke down, communications broke down, everything broke down. It was every man for himself. We were inadequately clothed. We didn't have rubber overshoes, we didn't have overcoats, we didn't have gloves, we didn't have scarves. My boots were so bad, I would strip newspapers and drapery off of these bombed out houses and wrap my feet in it. You were having trouble breathing because the snow was suffocating you. And consequently, we lost a lot of men who froze to death.
I think what is so, I guess, monumental as a historian is the pace at which the Pacific Campaign moved from 1942 until the spring of 1945, right on the edge of the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At the same time, looking at the North African arrival in 42 and getting to the Battle of the Bulge and, of course, victory over Europe Day in May of 45, the two opposite sides of the world are moving at the war at about the same pace. So from North Africa and Midway all the way to Okinawa and Iwo Jima and Battle of the Bulge to victory over Europe and, of course, the bombing in Japan, both of those theaters moved at about the same pace. And I think that's monumental. The second other monumental facet of this is the undertaking that the United States did on the home front. I know we discussed the home front in a few lessons ago, but what was required as far as manpower and armament and tanks and fuel and weaponry and food, both in Japan and both in Europe. The just scope of getting that supply chain opened and continuing throughout this war is what makes this just so historically monumental. And I'm kind of brokenhearted because I would love to spend an exhaustive amount of time, a whole semester, or even a whole school year, talking about just the Battle of the Bulge, or talking about just the D-Day invasion, or examining Rommel and Montgomery in North Africa. Looking at Patton or all of these other giants that we see in World War II. But for the sake of our discussions today, we have to just pare it down and give you kind of the bare essentials. But if you are interested in this, I encourage you to go through and look at any of the countless resources that are out there and seeing the incredibleness that is the Second World War. And the other component of this is the fact that we're not going to be unpacking period 8 and period 9. The legacies of both of these campaigns in the Pacific and in Europe are going to be felt as the Soviet Union begins to evolve from the Second World War into the Cold War, and how the lessons from both of these huge theatrical campaigns are going to be bore out in the Cold War and, of course, in other campaigns like Korea and Vietnam. But for the sake of today, we can't do that. So as the Allies pushed from the Battle of the Bulge into Germany and finally securing the capital of Berlin, and the Soviets coming in from the east, it was at that point that Germany decided to surrender, to the suicide of Adolf Hitler and much to the horrific discoveries of these concentration camps. Again, that's an entirely separate lesson of what the Allies found in Dachau and Birkenau and Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen and these other concentration camps. There was a brief moment, though, in May of 1945 in which the Allies were able to celebrate victory over Europe. And again, remember, the campaigns in Okinawa and Iwo Jima just wrapped up the month before, and military leaders are still deciding what to do with Japan. So while there was victory secured in Europe, there is still a major world war occurring in the Pacific. But for a brief moment, let's take a look at some original documents, some original primary source documents of the world celebrating this victory over Germany.
This is the BBC Home Service. We're interrupting programs to make the following announcement. It is understood that in accordance with arrangements between the three great powers, an official announcement will be broadcast by the Prime Minister at 3 o'clock tomorrow. In view of this fact, tomorrow, Tuesday, will be treated as Victory in Europe Day.
After nearly 6 long years, the war in Europe is finally over. May 8th, 1945 is declared Victory in Europe Day. Spontaneous celebrations erupt throughout the world.
French soldiers pick me up, hoist me on their shoulders, and carry me down the Champs-Élysées shouting, "Vive la France! Vive l'Amérique!"
After 4 years of service in 5 countries, U.S. Army nurse June Wandry is on furlough in Paris on VE Day.
We are in the heart of Paris. The crowd is nearly hysterical. Everyone is out on the streets, planes zooming overhead in huge formations. All the important brass are there, de Gaulle, and here I am.
A very great crowd is collected already. Thousands upon thousands of people gathered to share this historic day with the King and Queen. Listen to the crowd.
The last communique of World War II is in. The Russian people were told for the first time of Germany's unconditional surrender.
Our rejoicing is sobered and subdued by a supreme consciousness of the terrible price we have paid to rid the world of Hitler and his evil band. Let us not forget, my fellow Americans, our victory is but half won. The West is free, but the East is still in bondage to the treacherous tyranny of the Japanese. When the last Japanese division has surrendered unconditionally, then only will our fighting job be done.
So Truman setting the stage for what inevitably is going to be the most difficult decision of his presidency, and dare I argue, the most difficult decision in American history. How is the United States going to respond to Japan's efforts to continue the war? Is it going to require land troops, much like the D-Day invasion, and thousands and thousands and thousands of more deaths, and then marching on land towards Tokyo? Or will there be an air assault? Or will there just be a simple bombing of a new weaponry that has been discovered? And so our next discussion, we will talk about American justification for the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I'm going to make the historical argument that the dropping of those atomic bombs wasn't necessarily the last two shots fired in the Second World War, but the first shots fired in the Cold War. So I encourage you to join me for that discussion ahead. And we'll have a micro-write with the atomic bomb lesson this week. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that does it for me. I, again, thank you for tuning in on just this very broad overview of the Pacific and the European theaters. There is so much more that we could have unpacked with World War II, but for the sake of time and in the midst of our distance learning, that's all that we are going to get to. So I hope that you're able to articulate, should you have a prompt in the future that talks about analyzing the extent to which the United States was successful in both the Pacific and in the European campaigns. What was it about the United States? What was it about the American spirit? What was it about the American economic footprint? What was it about the advance of technology that allowed the United States and its allies to be successful in both of these campaigns? All right, Nagasaki and Hiroshima coming up in our next lesson, and then we're going to do a period 7 overview in the AP classroom, in which we go all the way back to American imperialism and progressivism, World War I, Roaring '20s, Great Depression, New Deal. So we've got a big, huge kind of umbrella that we're going to cast over our entire period 7, and that will conclude then the acquisition of new content for AP US History. And then we're going to go back to the very beginning. Christopher Columbus setting his first feet upon the shores of the Caribbean islands, the Lesser Antilles, and the beginning of a new British colony, and of course, a United States. So the journey is far from over, but at least from acquisition of new material, it will end this week, and we'll begin to just review and get prepared for that AP exam coming up next month. All right, my friends, thank you so much for tuning in. Be healthy, stay wise, and I look forward to seeing you in our next gathering.